Cool. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Unfortunately, Nat came down with flu-like symptoms. So with the current situation, we decided that it probably wasn't for the best to be in the same space, which is what we planned. But I do have questions. So I'm just going to go through the questions and answer them. Firstly, my name's Christian Thompson. I'm a contemporary artist. My work, I was formerly trained in sculpture and textiles, but I work across a range of different mediums from photography, video, sculpture, sound, performance, and more recently, virtual reality. I'm just going to go through the questions that have been sent through. I guess the first question is, can you just tell us about your practice and the way that you work? Well, I think that firstly, I'm kind of more of a conceptual artist. So my work always starts off with a conceptual premise. And then for me, it's about finding the best medium or material to best execute that premise of the work. So works that are kind of more static often take the form of photography, and works that are more performative, I've moved into video. And slowly, I think over the course of my 21-year career has been a kind of slow progression towards real time. So starting off with sculpture and textiles, which were very, always had a kind of sartorial or kind of performative element to them. And then photography became a really convenient medium for me to capture the performative element of my soft sculptural work. And then gradually I then moved towards video, and then sound and performance and virtual reality. The second question is, how has COVID-19 impacted you and your projects? Well, this year was pretty much planned out right until September. I had Melbourne Art Fair, Auckland Art Fair, a solo show at City Gallery in Wellington called Oracles, which actually just opened last Thursday. And then a solo show in London. So all of those projects have been pushed back until next year. But weirdly, it kind of sort of worked out in a strange way because all of those projects were kind of more towards the middle of the year. I sort of did all of my work in the first 3 months of this year. So now I've completed all of the work, and I've just been using this time to kind of meditate on those works, to finesse them and to sort of retouch them until I'm happy with them. So, I mean, in some ways it's kind of like, I really haven't taken a break in 21 years. I haven't actually really stopped and considered or had a moment to stop, as things just cumulatively got busier and busier. So in a weird way, I kind of feel like it's sort of a blessing and a curse, because it's obviously it's a shame that all of the projects weren't able to go forward, but it has given me time to kind of take sort of stock of where I am in my career and where I would like to move to next. The third question is, how has your internationality influenced your work? And what do you think you gained from living abroad for many years? Well, I left Australia, I think probably in 2007, like late 2007. And I lived in Berlin for 3 months because my program, I was accepted into a Masters of Theatre at the Amsterdam School of Arts. And it didn't start until early 2008. So I moved to Berlin for 3 months, and then moved to Amsterdam and lived there for 3 years, where I was studying. And then after I finished that program, I really had no interest in doing further postgraduate education straight away. But it was around that time that a scholarship program was announced for Aboriginal students to go to the University of Oxford. And my friend at the time was like, well, you should just put in an application because, it's better to be in the mix than not in the mix. So I put in an application. At that time, I was kind of, thought that I would move back home. And I ended up having 2 phone interviews, then coming back to Australia, and then flying to the UK, having an in-person interview, and then coming back, and then moving to England shortly thereafter. So I literally just packed my bags, came home, packed my bags, and then went overseas again. What I think that I've gained from that experience, I think, is that I've gained a world view. And I think that when I lived in Australia, I mean, I'd already, I think I had my first show in 1999 with Michael Riley at the Australian Centre of Contemporary Art, of Contemporary Photography. So at that point when I left, I'd already had like an 11-year career in Melbourne and in Australia, but felt that I needed to push myself further. And I think that sort of goes back to the idea of moving closer to real time, because I felt that in my earlier works, I wasn't in a lot of the work. I used to invite other people from the Aboriginal community in Melbourne to participate in my work. And slowly I wasn't in the first series, but I was in the second series, and then Emotional Striptease won it with, several other models. But then it became more clear that my kind of body and the politic of my body was a kind of an armature that I could sort of build on top of. And so the desire to move closer to performance was something that I felt like it would be a challenge for me as an artist, but I think that it would also kind of push me out of my comfort zone and move my practice forward as well. So yeah, I think I gained a kind of a world view, and so I saw my practice and also kind of what I was doing more in terms of a kind of global sort of conversation. Question 4 is, can you tell us about your mentorship with Marina Abramovich? Yeah, I was one of 10 artists, I think, who were invited to do a mentorship with Marina Abramovich at Caldor Arts Projects in Sydney. It was really interesting because we had kind of orbited each other in a strange way. Marina had also worked with the Pitt Rivers Museum collection, and we had friends in common, and I was meant to do a performance with Ulay at the Aboriginal Art Museum in Utrecht in the Netherlands. So there were all of these kind of moments where I felt like there was a strong crossover. So when I actually met Marina, I felt like we kind of already knew each other. And it was a really amazing experience, I think, to be able to spend that amount of time with someone as kind of established and as widely known as Marina for 2 weeks, but then also to participate in the in her work as well. So I did the rice and lentil challenge. I know that's not what it's called, but that's the kind of task where people separate lentils and rice. And I tried 3 times. The first time I didn't do it. The second time I didn't do it, but the third time I finally was able to count all of the lentils and rice in 6.5 hours, and with the noise cancelling headphones on. And it was a really interesting experience because once you have the noise cancelling headphones on, it kind of blocks out all of the peripheral noise, and it's almost like your mind's eye becomes very focused on the task at hand. And when I finally came out of that after counting rice and lentils for 6.5 hours and took the headphones off, I was very lightheaded and very dizzy. So it was almost like a very sort of physically and mentally fatiguing kind of process. But we've stayed in contact and we've stayed friends, and Marina has kind of pushed me into working in other areas. It was actually Marina who pushed me into working in VR, because I'd never really thought of working in VR before. And Marina was doing a project with Jeff Koons and I always mess up this guy's name, but Olafcian, I can't say his name, sorry. She was kind of like, do you work in the VR? And I was like, no, I don't really work in VR. And she was like, you should work in VR. And I was like, I don't really work in the VR. And she goes, work in the VR. I went, I will work in VR. So that's kind of how I ended up applying for the Modern Family VR Commission, which brings us to the next question. It says, in 2019, you were awarded the inaugural Acme Modern Family VR Commission. How was it making your first VR film? I kind of knew that I wanted to move my practice further, and I knew that I wanted to make a film eventually. And it was a very different process. I think coming from a sort of performance background, or coming from a visual arts background, but then kind of moving into performance, there was always this kind of, I think with visual artists, we tend to bring things down to their purest form. Whereas with theatre, and I think also with film, is the desire to draw things out into kind of narrative. It was a very different process. We, from the original kind of inception of the idea right through to the execution, I mean, it was like just over 5-minute work, but it took over a year to make, because we had to fly to Barcaldine in central Queensland, where my family's from, to film all of the templates of the riverbed where the work is kind of based on. And then there was the sound component. I worked with a sound company here in Melbourne. And then there was the actual VR component of it as well. So there were like many different components to this work. And it was kind of masochistic, but I also kind of want to do it again. So yeah, and I think the work was kind of, it was the next obvious kind of step forward, I think, for me, from working in, I just finished I did a work for my survey exhibition, Ritual Intimacy, that toured for a couple of years. And part of that show was to make a new commission, and that was a multi-channel video work, immersive sound environment, and titled Berserse. And that was kind of the biggest team that I'd ever worked with making a video work. So VR seemed to be the next obvious step forward from that work. The next question is, when do you think you first realized you were an artist? I think probably around the age of maybe 10 or 11, or maybe even younger actually. But my grandmother gave me a camera, those old Instamatic cameras that had the cube flash that you would stick in the top of it. And much to my poor younger brother's dismay, I was often kind of, convincing them to appear in my photographs. So I used to would lay on the ground out in Barcaldine, and they would jump off fence posts, and I would take photos of them as they were flying through the air. Or I also used backdrops and kind of, so I was sort of doing that kind of very sort of stagey sort of approach, even at that age. The next question is, how has your doctoral research at Oxford University continued to influence and shape your work? Well, I started doing my PhD at Oxford in 2010. And my project was, well, I really had no idea what I was going to do, actually. All I knew is that that's where the Pitt Rivers Museum was, and that I wanted to work with that collection. And I don't know if many people are familiar with the Pitt Rivers Museum, but it's kind of a museum of what museums were like at the turn of the last century. So it's much more in the kind of vein of the Wunderkammer or Cabinet of Curiosities, and everything in the museum is organized by object, not by country and culture and region. So you'll have vitrines that are just full of smoking paraphernalia, or vitrines that are full of percussive kind of instruments, or vitrines full of Northern American kind of traditional costumes and dress, or vitrines full of English folklore material. So it's kind of, it's almost like a sort of time capsule of like how museums sort of operated at that time. And when I arrived, it coincided at the same time as an Australian Research Council grant project that was being spearheaded by Jane Lydon, who at the time was at the University of Western Australia, and Chris Morton, who is the curator of manuscripts at the Pitt Rivers Museum. And they were looking at repatriating images of Aboriginal people in collections in Europe, in France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, the UK, and there's another country that I'm forgetting. But they invited me to create a visual response to, as part of the ARC project, a visual response to the Australian photographic collection. And I knew that, so that kind of worked out. It was just perfect timing, really, that my candidacy coincided with that Research Council grant project. So that really kind of defined the parameters of my research project. And I was really looking at the idea of looking at sort of how other artists had historically worked with museums: Fred Wilson, James Luna, Andrea Fraser, who else? The whole slew of different people. And I wanted to engage the collection, but I wanted to build on the work of those other artists, but also to push it in a new direction. So historically, there was kind of a genre, the Fred Wilson school, where people would re-exhibit objects from collections and to kind of highlight certain historical conflicts. So Fred Wilson would exhibit slave shackles on a tea set, for example. I was really interested in, because I was working with the photographic collection, one thing I really noticed about the material was that often there was a lot of, well, there was always all of the information about the photographer was kind of widely abundant and documented, yet the people in the images, there was very little documentation about who those people were, where they came from, not even their names. So it would just say Aboriginal woman, Victoria, Gippsland. And I mean, that's kind of like, that would be considered a lot of information. So for me, it was about kind of returning some sense of agency to the subjects and taking the attention away from the colonial author and redirecting that attention back to the actual subjects of the photographs. So I decided that I didn't want to exhibit any of the material. Rather, I wanted to allow the photographic collection to become a kind of directorial force in the kind of work that I was making. So I think kind of being in that environment in the museum context for such a long time, I began to really consider the rubric of museum display, how objects are presented, and also how, like, historically, the sort of historical kind of narrative and how that is often kind of weaponized to further alienate and marginalize people. And yeah, that was my kind of intention with that body of work. But then the work that I made after that, Museum of Others and the Equinox series, these works are still very much informed by this idea of the museum, but I'm also sort of redirecting the attention more to the biographies of the personal biographies of these sort of like colonial or colonist sort of figures, and also sort of navigating my way sort of inside and around the museum context. So I'll just got some more questions here. How did sound become part of your visual practice? Well, I was actually doing sound work in my first year of art school. Actually, I was making videos where I was singing in my dad's language, in our traditional language, and filming kind of different surfaces. So I would like have a bucket full of water, and I would just film the water moving, and then I would be sort of singing over the top of it. So sound has actually been a part of my work for, well, yeah, since like 1996 or something like that. And it's gradually sort of taken on different kind of guises, but sound has kind of always been there, and it's kind of, I've always felt very comfortable kind of singing in my own language, more comfortable than I feel when I'm singing in English. And I think there's just something in our traditional language that's very kind of lyrical and soothing and very kind of poetic. And I think for a lot of my sound works, I've always been more interested in the idea that, well, I mean, they're kind of based on a very simple premise that if our language which is considered a endangered or extinct language, even if one word of it is being spoken, then it can't be considered an extinct language. And I think that culture and identity is something that you have to practice every single day. So for me, my work has provided me with a context and a platform to not only archive my culture and language, but to reinvigorate that, to re-energize it and present it in ways that is very much about the sort of contemporary present. And that's kind of filtered through my own experience. So a lot of my work comes from a process of autoethnography, where I combine my sort of formal Western art education and training with very kind of informal ways of working. And so those things all sort of meld together, and the end result is the sort of work that I make. The next question is, where do you work, in the studio, or do you develop your ideas outside of the art lexicon? I don't work in a studio. I never have. It's just something that I need to be doing things. And I think there's a really strong relationship between my physical well-being and my ability to be able to make my work. And if I'm kind of neglecting myself in some way, then the ideas don't come to me as readily. But I would say that my studio is really in my head, and I'm just constantly like kind of, I'm a bit of a bowerbird, so I'm constantly sort of gathering things whether it's a color combination, like in a magazine, or if I'm reading something, I will often get images from what I'm reading, or film, or just being in nature. I think those things kind of always feed into my practice. But I find if I'm swimming or if I'm exercising in some ways, that's where my ideas seem to come to me, when I'm in a more kind of sort of meditative state. But, you know, my works, they're constantly percolating. It's constantly kind of being reconfigured and recomposed and reworked in my mind. And then when it actually is the right time to make the work, it will sort of come to me as a complete image, and then I will feel this impulse that I have to make this work now. Which is interesting, because one of my best friends said to me the other day, she was like, I find it really interesting because how your work sort of always ties in with what is well, sort of how it ties in with the kind of socio-political climate. It seems to always resonate with that. And that's, I think, because I'm very much connected to what's sort of going on in our immediate world, but then I'm also kind of looking into historical. But I think underneath in all of my work, there's always a kind of strong sort of aspirational quality, and I'm always trying to push the conversation forward. And I think because being a child of the 90s, I think that you know, the worst thing was to kind of be considered like mainstream. I don't know whether anyone remembers that from the 90s, but it was just like, oh God, I don't want to be mainstream. So I think I've always been attracted to things that come from the margins. And I think that's a space where I've always felt like I have been situated. And I take those ideas and I filter them through my own sort of formal training, and I present them in a way that is accessible and popular. So I think it's actually quite hard. I think it's harder to make something that's popular and conceptual than it is to make something that is kind of more readily, you know, read in the terms of like sort of conceptual art language. Because I think when you make something that's popular and also conceptual, you're actually implanting sort of more challenging ideas into the popular consciousness. And I think that's always been sort of a drive in my practice, is about pushing the culture forward in some way. The next question is, how do you relate to photography and the performative aspects of your portraits? I mean, I personally think that I am more of a sculptor who utilizes photography from the perspective of a sculptor as opposed to a more traditional photographer. So I tend to build pictures rather than take photos. And yeah, I mean, I think the kind of juxtaposition between my own physical body and the politics of my own body, and then the kind of images, the materials, the references that I make, it's that tension that creates this kind of, you know, very unique sort of nature of my work. I was actually chatting to an academic once, and he said to me, "You wear history." And I thought that was really interesting. I thought it was a very interesting interpretation of what I do, because I think it was very accurate. It's like, yeah, I kind of look into history, and then I re-examine those things, and I then bring them into the contemporary present, and then present them in a way that is very much my own and filtered through my own experience. The next question is, you look out at the viewer in a particular way in your portraits, but sometimes you turn away. How important is the gaze, and how do you want to be looked at? Sometimes there's a very kind of direct gaze, and then other times it's more kind of obscured. I guess it just depends on the kind of overall kind of sort of nature of the work, depending on how sort of more, I don't know, kind of visible I am, and sometimes, you know, not so visible. But I do think the gaze is very important. I think we often just are attracted to the figurative. I think this kind of format allowed me to kind of be able to move quite freely around the world and sort of carry my studio with me. And my studio was kind of inside this photographic frame, or this particular kind of template. And then I was able to build ideas around that, and to sort of work in that space. The next question is, how do you feel when people recognize you in the street? It's funny because that's kind of like a strange byproduct of my practice, that I actually had no sort of real intention of, you know, it was never I was more focused on the ideas rather than the, you know, the outcome. And then I kind of, not the outcome, but I was more focused on the conceptual premise of the work and less focused on me being in the work. So it's an interesting, I often forget that I've basically been exhibiting photos of myself for like over 20 years, and that people recognize me. But for the most part, people are really lovely. And I've had some really interesting experiences. Once I got a cab in Sydney, and the cab driver's like, he's like, "Oh, I know you." He goes, "You're a photographer, aren't you?" And I went, "Yeah, I am." And he was like, "Yeah, I gave you a ride like 5 years ago." And he still remembered me from that cab ride. So it's funny how you get those kind of interactions. But for the most part, it's really lovely. And I think people really, I mean, it's great. It means that the work's part of the sort of popular zeitgeist, and people recognize you because they know your work. And I think that's great. The next question is, do you see costume as sculpture, or do you see it as theatrical? I see costume as sculptural, because I don't think that I'm necessarily, it's not necessarily the sartorial aspect of the soft sculptural work that I make that is the driving force. It's often the kind of materiality, and I'm often using materials like found objects and then reconfiguring them into sort of soft sculptural kind of sculptural work. So it's less sartorial and more material and costume. Okay, just got some other questions here. How do you see gender in relation to your work? Is it fluid, or do you see it as a kind of drag? That's interesting, actually, because I was like kind of thinking the other day about how in sort of traditional sort of creation stories, for example, the rainbow serpent can be considered male, female, gender, or neuter. So even our creation God had no particular gender. I do think in a kind of landscape where often I think there can be this idea that there are somehow two separate schools, that there's kind of like the Aboriginal art school and then the kind of Western art school. And I'm kind of like, you know, a combination of both of those things, because I've kind of, I have a sort of informal traditional education, but I went through the sort of Western art sort of educational process as well. But I think, again, sort of like going back to I think that kind of like sort of pushing the idea of gender, I think that's kind of always been there in my work from the beginning as well. But I think that was also sort of like something about being connected to kind of like, I think in the Polaris series, where I sort of presented myself as these kind of like almost kind of mythological figures. I think in that work they were neither male nor female. They were kind of almost like metaphysical, kind of spiritual figures. And I think in Equinox as well, I was kind of interested in kind of navigating my way around the idea of colonization and critiquing these colonial figures, but from a sort of more metaphysical point of view, like a spiritual kind of sort of rereading of these objects. Yeah, so I think that's kind of, I think the idea of sort of like the margins and the kind of, you know, ideas that set out sort of more traditional gender definitions has come from like the environment that I grew up in, but then those ideas are sort of present in sort of traditional culture and beliefs as well. So I like to really fuse those things together. Yeah, so that's kind of all of the questions. Does anyone have something they'd like to ask me? No? So no questions? A question here from Toby. Hi, Toby. Are you making work responding to the current global crisis? Um, Not really. I mean, I've already made, like I said earlier, I've already kind of made the work um, that I was planning on exhibiting this year. Um, yeah, no, no, I'm not, yeah, not really, not at this moment. Okay. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I think we'll just finish up. And yeah, thanks so much for having me, and I hope everyone's faring well during this this current situation. And yeah, wishing you all the best. Thanks.